This story happened to me back when I was in middle school. To give you some background, we used to live in a very rundown old house in a similarly rundown and old neighborhood. Our house had two types of fences, a tall wooden one at the very back of our backyard, and a standard white picket fence surrounding the front and sides of the property. During the first year we lived there, the neighborhood was extremely quiet. We rarely saw any of our neighbors or heard much of anything. But that changed when I started hearing knocking at my bedroom window. This went on for a few weeks, and every time I told my parents about it, they didn't believe me. I've always been quite spiritual, and back then, I was convinced the house was haunted. It was always creaking and making strange noises, which I took as signs of a ghostly presence. The knocking grew louder and more frequent as the weeks went by. It got to the point where I thought the sound was coming from a mirror in my room because it was so loud it seemed to be right there beside me. My room had two windows, one above my nightstand and another right beside my bed. The knocking always came from the window above my nightstand. The window by my bed had a big metal box with loud fans underneath it. I'm not sure what it was called. Meanwhile, there were some bushes beneath the window above my nightstand. Over the following weeks, the knocking became even more intense. Eventually, I confided in my younger sister about it, since my parents still didn't believe me. That's when I discovered she had also been hearing loud knocking from her windows. I told my parents that both of us had been hearing strange noises, and my dad said he investigated but didn't find anything. There is one night that stands out vividly in my memory. I had built a pillow fort in my room using chairs and sheets and was sleeping in it. It was late summer, and I couldn't fall asleep, so I watched videos on YouTube. Eventually, I put my phone on the nightstand, rolled over, and tried to sleep. That's when the soft tapping on my window started again. By this point, I was used to it, but it still terrified me. I lay completely still, hoping it would stop, but it didn't. The tapping grew into loud knocks and soon escalated into violent pounding on my window. I was so scared that I refused to move. I even started crying, because I thought the glass would shatter from the force of the banging. I could hear the window shaking as it continued, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. After that night, the knocking seemed to taper off, but then stranger things began to happen. I remember looking at the bushes under my window and noticing they were disturbed in a weird way. That's when it really hit me. A person had been knocking, not a ghost. There were other strange occurrences in the house, too. One night, when my family got home late, I heard a phone ping from the large bushes under my sister's window. It was pitch dark outside, so I couldn't see anyone, but I swear I heard a phone notification sound. This happened twice, once when I was outside and a few nights later when I was in bed. We also started finding random rocks and marbles outside. I didn't think much of it at first, but it was strange. We would find large rocks, the kind you'd see at a playground, outside in front of our garage. Our house didn't have any rocks like that, and along with them, we would find small marbles scattered around. The reason I suspect our neighbor is behind all of this is that he was the only neighbor we ever saw. Even though it was rare to see him, he would sometimes be in his yard. If he noticed me looking at him, he would quickly move out of sight behind our tall wooden fence. There was one day in particular that really scared me and my sister. My dad was out, so it was just my mom, my sister, let's call her Elle, and me at home. Elle and I were sitting on the back porch swing, which was something we did regularly as the sun began to set. We were facing the white fences, and as I was looking around the yard, I saw him, our neighbor, peering over the fence, watching us. I tried to ignore him, but then he started walking along the fence, pacing back and forth while watching us without saying a word. He did this for several minutes until our mother noticed him through the window. She quickly made us come inside and watched him from the glass back door. He kept pacing, staring at the house. After a while of this, with no signs of him stopping or leaving, my mom called our grandfather to come over and told my dad to come back home. Once our grandfather showed up, the neighbor finally went back into his house. After that incident, things seemed to calm down a bit. We still heard occasional knocks and found rocks, but the neighbors stayed out of sight. My fears about a stalker were confirmed after we moved out. The family that moved in after us had two sons, around the same age as Elle and me. Not long after they moved in, they reported an unsettling experience. One of their sons had accidentally thrown something valuable away and went outside at night to retrieve it from the trash. The next morning, they found a note on their front porch, not in the mailbox. If I remember correctly, it said something like, "I saw your son last night digging through the trash. You should tell him to be more careful. You never know who might be watching." The family moved out shortly after that. When I told my parents about what the new family had experienced, they admitted the new residents had been dealing with similar strange things like we had. As far as I know, no one has lived in that house since, and the person who left the notes and caused all those disturbances was never caught. It still freaks me out to think about how my parents didn't believe us until another family went through the same terrifying experiences. This experience is relatively short, but it's another strange one from my time working at the local port on the night shift as a security guard. The port was massive, spanning a 2-mile radius, and every night I had to patrol the entire perimeter and check every office building. The rounds typically took about an hour to an hour and a half to complete, even with 2 guards on patrol. On this particular night, my usual partner called in sick, so I had to do the rounds on my own. The supervisor stayed at the front gate post, watching the monitors. At around 2 a.m., I finished the outdoor patrol in the truck. Sometimes we used a 4-wheeler or a bike, but that night it was just me and the truck. After completing the outdoor patrol, I had to go inside every single building to make sure no one had stayed behind after hours and that there were no intruders on the property. The buildings were pitch dark inside because the maintenance crew would turn off all the breakers before leaving. Unfortunately, security didn't have access to the keys to turn the lights back on, so I had to rely on my flashlight to navigate the hallways and offices. The offices themselves were already eerie due to their age, and walking through them alone in the dark made the whole situation even creepier. It was so quiet in there that the sound of my steel-toe boots echoed down the hallways. The next part is a bit of a blur because I started to feel chills and my breathing became rapid. As I was walking through the dark office hallways, I suddenly heard a scratching noise on the walls right next to me. I stopped to listen, and the scratching stopped too. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, so I continued walking. But then, I froze in my tracks. The scratching noise started again, louder this time. At that moment, I knew this wasn't something normal. It felt like something sinister was playing with me. I had just checked those offices, and there was no one inside. My heart was pounding, and I found myself stuck in the middle of the building, with the nearest exit on the far side. Suddenly, I heard a loud pounding on the wall. Fueled by adrenaline, I started sprinting towards the exit, but the pounding followed me down the hallway, keeping pace with my steps. When I finally reached another hallway, the pounding stopped. Whatever was making that noise sounded big, and I tried calling the supervisor to report it, but there was no signal in the building. I was so overwhelmed with anxiety that I couldn't bring myself to finish the rounds. I headed back to the front gate and decided to write a report about what happened. For the first time in my life, I wrote a report on the paranormal. I didn't think it could be explained logically because the noises were unbelievably loud, far louder than any human could have made. Whatever was pounding on the wall was not human. I'm certain of that. Being a child often means living in a world filled with innocence and simplicity, but sometimes even the most innocent experiences can become frighteningly real. I was about 6 or 7 years old when a chilling event happened that still haunts me. I was attending a summer camp that my parents had enrolled me in, and I was part of the group for kids aged 6 and 7, the youngest group at the camp. One day, while we were at the playground, an older man sitting on a bench began talking to me. He knew my name, which made me feel unusually comfortable around him. He offered me a piece of candy, which I gladly accepted, and then he offered to push me on the swing. I declined the swing ride but continued chatting with him, asking all sorts of questions that a child might ask. He introduced himself as Sam and said he was a friend of my mom. He mentioned that since my mom was running late, he would be picking me up after camp. I accepted this without much thought, believing it was perfectly normal. As the day came to a close, our counselors called us to line up by the gate to leave. We gathered in our designated area and waited for our parents to pick us up. I saw Sam approaching the bench, and he told one of my counselors, Jane, that he was there to pick me up since my mom was unavailable. Jane looked at me to confirm I knew Sam, and I nodded. Jane marked my name off her list and gave me a high five as I walked away with Sam. He held my hand as we walked, but I soon noticed he was walking much faster than I could manage. We reached his car, and he let me into the back seat, seeming hurried and anxious. He quickly got into the driver's seat, started the car, and drove off at high speed. I asked if he was taking me home, and he assured me that he was. It was then that I heard shouting outside the car. I looked out the rear window and saw two of my counselors pointing at the car and alerting a park supervisor. Panic set in as Sam shouted for me to get down. Terrified, I tried to open the door at a red light, only to find that the child lock was on. Sam tried to calm me down by apologizing and saying he was driving me home, but I was deeply frightened and began to doubt whether he was telling the truth. As we drove, I noticed that the surroundings were unfamiliar. I felt nauseous with fear as Sam muttered anxious words under his breath and kept glancing nervously at the rearview mirror. The situation escalated when a police siren wailed behind us, making Sam shout in frustration. He pulled over on a quiet residential street and instructed me to do whatever he said. However, the situation quickly spiraled out of his control. Two police officers emerged with their weapons drawn and ordered Sam out of the car with his hands up. He complied, was handcuffed, and laid face down on the ground. The officers then took him away in their car while another officer stayed with me, offering comfort and asking questions. Soon after, another police car arrived, followed by my mom in her minivan. She was in tears and hugged me tightly as soon as she arrived. It turned out that when Sam had picked me up, my mom had just reached the playground and was told by Jane that someone else had already taken me. In a panic, she and the staff had immediately tried to track us down and called the police. One of the camp supervisors had been following us on the road, which helped the police find us. Reflecting on that day, I wish I could erase it from my memory. The fear and uncertainty I felt were overwhelming, and it's unsettling to think about the potential dangers I might have faced if I hadn't been rescued. The experience remains deeply disturbing and is a sobering reminder of how fragile and vulnerable childhood can be. This story took place in 2015 during a solo hike I took in Arizona. The trail started with a stretch of desert before ascending a medium-sized mountain, which eventually led to a canyon-like passage at the summit. I often embarked on long hikes alone, sometimes lasting 8 to 10 hours, as a way to clear my mind and escape the stresses of daily life. The trail I chose that day seemed relatively unknown. There was no designated parking area, and the trailhead was hidden behind a dense thicket of bushes, with the path barely visible. I didn't actively seek out less traveled trails, but I preferred avoiding crowded ones, so I didn't mind that this path seemed to be off the beaten track. As I ventured further, the vegetation grew increasingly sparse. Many of the trees appeared dry and lifeless, with fallen branches and debris scattered across the trail. It was clear that this path hadn't been maintained for some time. The trail eventually led me through a thick expanse of overgrown bushes. Although the path was still discernible, it became more challenging to navigate. That's when I heard a peculiar sound, a faint whistle coming from up the mountain. The melody was brief but distinct, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I rationalized that it was probably another hiker, despite the eerie feeling it gave me. 20 minutes later, I heard the same whistling again, but this time it was much closer and louder. My unease grew, but I decided to press on, keeping my pocket knife within reach, just in case. As I continued, I encountered a fallen tree blocking the path, with thorny branches making it difficult to cross. I decided to circumvent it, veering to the right. Soon, I came across a small valley, which might have once been the bed of a river. In the center of the valley was a peculiar structure made of large sticks arranged in a complex manner. It looked man-made, and my unease deepened as I connected this with the earlier whistling. I felt an urgent need to leave, but before I could fully turn away, the same whistle came from right behind me. My heart raced with fear as I spun around to face the valley. To my astonishment, there was a goat standing directly where I had heard the whistle. Its eyes seemed to lock onto mine, and it stood completely still. The goat appeared much larger than any I had seen in the area, adding to my discomfort. I was utterly disoriented, struggling to process what was happening. After a few moments of intense fear, I managed to gather my composure and began to retreat slowly, never breaking eye contact with the goat. As I took a step backward, the goat opened its mouth slightly and emitted the same eerie whistle I had heard before. Overcome with terror, I bolted down the mountain, stumbling over trees and rocks in my frantic escape. I heard the whistle one last time, faintly echoing behind me as I finally reached the trailhead. I never shared this experience with anyone, fearing that no one would believe me and that I would appear irrational. It wasn't until recently, when I learned about skinwalkers, that I began to consider this as a possible explanation for what I encountered that day. The experience remains a chilling reminder of how the unknown can intersect with reality in the most unsettling ways. Ever since I was a child, fishing has been a cherished tradition in my family. My relatives would take me out on the water every chance they got, teaching me everything they knew. It became a family ritual, and as the youngest, I was next in line to inherit the so-called expertise that everyone in my family seemed to claim. My father, David, and his brother, Peter, were the most devoted. Their homes, much like ours, were filled with fishing gear, making it clear to anyone who visited that our lives revolved around the water. One of my favorite spots to fish is a secluded lake hidden deep in the woods, far from any roads or houses. It's a place where I can enjoy complete solitude, with no one else around. For years, I've been the only person fishing there. To make my trips easier, I started leaving my kayak by the lake, leaning it against a large tree whenever I wasn't using it. The kayak was heavy enough to stay upright even in strong winds, and I always made sure to cover it to keep animals from turning it into a shelter. One warm evening, as the sun began to set, I was out on the lake, casting my line and enjoying the peace. I had already caught a few trout, which were resting in the cooler at my feet. The sky gradually darkened, and I knew it would soon be time to head back. Just as I was preparing to pack up, I noticed something unusual on the shore. A figure standing by the water's edge, tipping a barrel and emptying its contents into the lake. At first, I wasn't sure what they were doing, but as I watched, it became clear that something harmful was being poured into the water. Concerned, I called out to the person, asking what they were doing. They looked up, startled, and then quickly fled into the woods, leaving the barrel behind. I paddled closer to the shore to get a better look and noticed that the liquid spilling into the lake was dark, possibly even red, though it was hard to tell in the dim light. A sense of unease settled over me, and I realized I didn't want to stay there any longer. As someone who deeply cares about the environment, seeing someone pollute the lake filled me with anger, but I also felt a growing sense of danger. I knew I had to report this incident to the local environmental authorities. I paddled back to my usual spot on the shore and began unloading my gear. As I was covering the kayak, I heard a sudden snap, like a branch breaking underfoot, not far from where I stood. My instincts told me to call out, but something stopped me. Instead, I hurriedly finished covering the kayak, leaving it on the ground instead of propping it against the tree as I usually did. With my gear in hand, I quickly made my way out of the woods, my heart racing with every step. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. When I finally reached the road that led to my house, I breathed a sigh of relief. The short walk home felt much longer than usual as I constantly glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following me. Once I arrived home, I wasted no time putting my gear away in the shed and locking the door behind me. The sense of unease from the lake hadn't left me. After rinsing off the trout and placing them in the fridge, I opted for a quick dinner of leftovers, too rattled to cook anything from scratch. As I waited for my food to heat up in the microwave, a knock at the front door shattered the quiet of the evening. My heart skipped a beat, and that uneasy feeling returned in full force. Who could be knocking at this hour? My lights were on, and my car was in the driveway, so whoever it was knew I was home. The knock came again, more insistent this time, just as the microwave beeped. Then, to my horror, I heard a voice from outside, calling through one of the open windows. "Excuse me, I think you saw me at the lake earlier. I'd like to explain." My stomach churned. The fact that this person had followed me home made my pulse quicken. There was no way I was opening the door. This was clearly someone with ill intentions. The man knocked on the window again, more forcefully now, and called out, "Hello? I just want to talk." I knew I had to respond, so I yelled back, "Leave now, or I'll call the police." My voice trembled slightly, but I tried to sound as firm as possible. I planned to call the police regardless, but I hoped the threat would scare him off. The man's tone shifted, and he responded calmly, "Sir, if you could just open the door, I can explain everything to you." His request made my skin crawl. There was no way I was letting him inside. I repeated my warning, and this time, I didn't hear a reply. After a tense moment of silence, I decided to lock all the windows and turn on the air conditioning, hoping to block out any more attempts to contact me. Then, I made a report to the non-emergency police line, detailing what I had seen at the lake and the man's attempt to follow me home. I also filed an online report with the local Department of Environmental Protection. Making these reports helped ease my anxiety a bit, but I still felt on edge. Later that night, around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by the sound of a crash coming from downstairs. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed the small revolver I kept in my bedroom for emergencies. I listened closely and heard the unmistakable sound of someone slowly creeping up the wooden staircase. Every step was deliberate, as if they were trying to be as quiet as possible. I took cover behind the dresser next to the closet, gun in hand, and waited. The footsteps grew closer, and soon, I heard the doorknob to my bedroom slowly turn. The door creaked open, and I could see the silhouette of a man entering the room. Without hesitation, I flicked on the lamp beside me and aimed my revolver at him, shouting, "Get on the ground, now." The man froze, raising his hands slightly in a gesture of surrender. In the dim light, I saw that he was holding a small blade. My heart raced as I ordered him to drop it. He hesitated for a moment, then said calmly, "I'm leaving," before turning and bolting out of the room. I shouted for him to stop, but he didn't listen. I could hear him rushing down the stairs and out the front door. As soon as he was gone, I hurried to lock the door behind him and called 911. My living room window was shattered, glass scattered all over the floor. I kept my eyes on that broken window until the police arrived. When the officers showed up, I explained everything to them, from the barrel being dumped into the lake to the man breaking into my house. I also gave them a description of the intruder, a short, bearded man with glasses, wearing a black flannel shirt and dark pants. They took down all the details and assured me they would investigate further. Later that night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep. I stayed in the living room, keeping watch with my revolver by my side. As dawn approached, I called my brothers. My brother, Jack, came over to help me fix the broken window, and he stayed with me for a few nights until things settled down. Looking back, I believe that the man was trying to hide something far more sinister than just dumping waste into the lake. My theory is that the barrel contained something illegal, possibly even human remains. Why else would he go to such lengths to follow me home and break into my house? The entire ordeal left me shaken, but it reinforced one important lesson. Always trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. That night, I knew that opening the door to that man could have led to something terrible.
My partner and I decided to head to Charleston, South Carolina, last Friday to celebrate my birthday. We booked a charming old bed and breakfast that dated back to the 1840s. The place had so much character, and I specifically requested a room with beautiful floral wallpaper that I had seen online. When we arrived, it was even more stunning than we had imagined. The room had 15-foot ceilings, a grand fireplace, a balcony with a view, and was filled with antique furniture. It felt like stepping back in time. We instantly fell in love with it. After a lovely dinner that evening, we returned to our room, exhausted from the day's activities, and quickly fell asleep. I'm not someone who usually wakes up during the night, but at around 1 a.m., I was suddenly awakened. I noticed my partner making strange sounds in his sleep, like he was unsettled, but I didn't think much of it and drifted back to sleep myself. That's when I had one of the most vivid dreams I've ever experienced. In the dream, everything in our room looked exactly as it did in real life. The door to the sitting room was closed. My luggage was placed precisely where I had left it, and I was lying in bed just as I was before I fell asleep. Suddenly, a woman appeared, floating swiftly across the room towards the foot of the bed. She came from the closed sitting room door on the left-hand side. Her presence was unsettling as she stared directly down at me, her gaze intense and unblinking. The strange part was how real it all felt, like I wasn't dreaming at all. I jolted awake immediately, sitting up in bed with my heart pounding. The air in the room felt thick, almost oppressive, and I was overwhelmed by the unsettling feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. It wasn't the first time I had felt this way. I have a strange knack for sensing when someone is watching me, even when I'm asleep. I often catch my partner looking at me while I'm dozing, and it always wakes me up. This time, however, the feeling was much more intense and frightening. I glanced at the clock, and of course, it was just after 3 a.m. The cliché of it all did nothing to ease my nerves. I woke my partner, and we stayed awake for the rest of the night, too uneasy to sleep. The next morning, we headed downstairs for breakfast. I decided to share my experience with one of the staff members, but her reaction wasn't what I expected. She politely asked me not to include it in any reviews and mentioned that she was a devout Christian who didn't believe in ghosts. She also hinted that the housekeeper had plenty of stories about our particular room. As we were finishing up our conversation, another guest walked in. His first words were, "This place is definitely haunted." Naturally, my partner and I were curious, so we asked him what had happened. He told us that his bathroom door kept swinging open all night, even though he had made sure to close it tightly. He mentioned that he was staying in room 202. At the time, we had no idea where that was, since the B&B had quite a few rooms. Later in the day, we used the back entrance to our room, and as we were walking in, I happened to glance at the door connected to ours. The room number? 202. That's when I decided to search online for information about our B&B and its haunted reputation. A flurry of articles popped up, including one about a man who had woken up to find a woman staring down at him at the end of his bed. The chilling part? It happened in the very room we were staying in. That's when things started to feel all too real for us. We're not the bravest when it comes to the paranormal, and we were both getting pretty spooked. Saturday passed without any major incidents, but when we returned from lunch, we found something odd. There was a washcloth lying on the bathroom counter that looked like it had been used. I asked my partner if he had used it, and he said no. I hadn't touched it either. When I picked it up, we both noticed something strange. There was a clear handprint imprinted on the towel. We spent several minutes examining it, trying to figure out how a handprint could be so distinct on a towel that neither of us had used. It was puzzling and unsettling, to say the least. I finally decided to address whatever presence might be sharing the room with us. I spoke aloud, saying that we meant no harm, that we respected their space, and that they didn't have permission to follow us when we left. After that, nothing else unusual happened for the rest of our stay. We returned home today, still talking about the strange events of the weekend. While we're both a bit rattled, we're also fascinated by the experience. Neither of us has ever encountered anything like it before. It's one of those stories we'll be retelling for years to come, a blend of excitement and unease that we won't soon forget. I always thought the legend of the black dog was just that, a legend. Something old-timers would talk about to keep each other awake on long hauls. A tale shared over the CB radio during those late-night stretches when the road seems to go on forever. That is, until I saw it for myself. It was during the final leg of a grueling 72-hour haul, and I was cruising down Route 50, not far from Reno. It was late, and the desert night had settled in, darker than anything you can imagine. Out there, the only light comes from your own headlights, barely enough to pierce the thick darkness ahead of you. To the sides, just endless desert, though you can't see a thing at that hour. The road stretches on, and all you can do is follow it. Occasionally, you might spot a possum or an armadillo, but they're hardly more than a bump under your tires. Anything bigger? That's a different story, cause for concern, and you'll want to hit the brakes before you end up stranded in the middle of nowhere. That night, the radio had gone silent, and the steady hum of the road began to feel like a lullaby. My eyelids grew heavy, each blink lasting longer than the last. My head started to dip, and before I knew it, I had nodded off, just for a moment, but long enough to wake up with my truck veering toward the ditch. I jerked the wheel, straightened out, and forced myself to stay alert. It worked for a while, but soon enough, that familiar drowsiness crept back in. This time I nodded off harder and longer. When I woke, my heart was pounding. I wasn't in my lane, but somehow, I had stayed on the road. As I looked out the passenger window, I thought I saw a light out there in the distance. But that couldn't be right. I was still too far from the city for any lights. It had to be my tired mind playing tricks on me. And then I saw it, the black dog. It was huge, like a wolf, just standing there in the middle of the road, staring down my rig with this eerie calmness. There was no fear in its eyes, no intention of moving. I didn't have time to swerve, so I slammed on the brakes. My foot hit the pedal so hard, I thought I might push it through the floor. The trailer jolted and rattled as the truck screeched to a halt, stopping just 15 feet from the creature. I blared the horn, hoping to scare it off, but it didn't flinch. So I decided to get out and try to shoo it away myself. But when I stepped around the front of the truck, I froze. This wasn't just any dog, it looked wrong, like something out of a nightmare. Its fur was patchy, and it was drooling a thick, black ooze from its slack jaw. Pieces of its flesh seemed to be melting off its bones, yet it just stood there, staring at me with those lifeless eyes. I tried clapping my hands, shouting, anything to get it to move, but it didn't budge. I took a few cautious steps toward it, and that's when it bared its fangs, yellow and glowing in the headlights. Every step I took, it mirrored, moving closer. Finally, I decided to make a move, thinking if I charged at it, maybe I could scare it off. But that was a mistake. The dog snarled and lunged at me, and I turned and ran, tripping over my own feet and falling hard onto the highway. I scrambled back, and just when I thought it would pounce, it stopped. The moment I was behind the nose of the truck, it backed off, retreating to the center of the road. At that point, I knew I needed a different approach. I spotted the tire thumper under the seat in the cab, a solid tool for checking tire pressure and, in this case, maybe for dealing with this creature. I grabbed it and, in one swift motion, jumped out of the truck, ready to face the dog head-on. But when I rounded the front of the rig again, the dog was gone. Not run off, just gone, like it had vanished into thin air. Before I could even catch my breath, a dune buggy shot across the highway about 100 yards ahead, coming out from behind a stand of cacti. I could hear the whoops and hollers of teenagers inside, their wild joyride interrupted as a beer can bounced out of the buggy and rolled right to my feet. And that's when it hit me. If that black dog hadn't shown up when it did, I would have been right in the path of that dune buggy. At the speed we were both going, it would have been a disaster. My truck would have torn through that buggy, and those kids wouldn't have stood a chance. I might not have made it out of that either. I used to think the stories about the black dog were just that, stories. But after that night, I'm not so sure. Maybe it was luck, or maybe there's something more to it. Either way, I'm glad I saw it. As I write this, it's early July. This story took place at the beginning of summer, a time when I usually try to escape my hometown. I prefer to spend my summers either hanging around my college town or traveling to Europe, anything to avoid going back home. But this year, my plans fell through, and I found myself reluctantly returning home for a week before heading off to Germany. I wasn't in the mood to reconnect with old friends, but staying home wasn't appealing either. So I spent my days hiking, watching movies, or just driving aimlessly around town. It was my last day home, and I found myself craving a bit of excitement after days of routine. I remembered how my friends and I used to hop on freight trains, a thrill-seeking habit I'd left behind long ago. But on that day, nostalgia and boredom got the better of me. I decided to drive out to a secluded set of tracks I knew well, tucked away in the woods. Freight trains passed through regularly, and I figured I could relive an old adventure one last time. The tracks ran through thick trees, leading to a tunnel, and beyond that, a massive bridge stretched over a river. My friends and I used to ride the train all the way across the bridge, but since I was alone, I didn't want to risk getting stranded miles away from my car. My plan was simple: hop on the train, ride through the tunnel, then hop off and walk back. It was early afternoon when I parked my car and made my way to the tracks. I waited for about 10 minutes before I felt the familiar vibration of a train approaching. I quickly moved to the side, staying hidden in the foliage. I knew that most freight train conductors didn't care about trespassers, but I didn't want to push my luck. As the train rumbled past, I picked a car that looked easy to climb onto and jogged alongside it, just like I'd done so many times before. Grabbing hold of the ladder, I swung myself up with ease. The train wasn't moving too fast, and I settled in, ready for a short ride. Just as the train was about to enter the tunnel, I saw a strange flash of light from up ahead. It caught me off guard, but I shrugged it off, thinking it was probably just a spark from the train. The tunnel loomed closer, and as the train picked up speed, I closed my eyes, letting the rush of adrenaline take over. Then, out of nowhere, I felt a cold hand grab my leg. I nearly lost my grip on the ladder, but instinct kicked in, and I held on tight. I kicked out, trying to free myself, but the train sped on, and whatever had grabbed me let go. My heart was pounding, and before I could process what had just happened, another hand reached up and slapped against my leg. Panic surged through me, and I scrambled up the ladder, out of reach, my mind racing. What on earth had just happened? The train burst out of the tunnel, and without thinking, I jumped off. I watched the train continue on its path, crossing the bridge and disappearing into the distance. In the small clearing beyond the tunnel, I paced back and forth, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Who or what was in that tunnel? And why had they tried to grab me? Then it hit me the only way back to my car was through that tunnel. A cold dread settled over me. There was no way I was going back through there with those people, or whatever they were waiting inside. Walking across the bridge wasn't an option either. It was too dangerous, and a train could come at any moment. I sat down, feeling trapped. Calling for help seemed pointless. I was trespassing, and the police wouldn't exactly be sympathetic. I had no choice. I picked up a rock, trying to steel myself for the walk back through the tunnel. As I entered the tunnel, every sound seemed amplified. The darkness closed in around me, and I could hear a faint clicking noise echoing through the space. It sounded like someone clicking their tongue, but it could have been something else entirely. My nerves were on edge, and every step felt heavier than the last. I froze in place, fear gripping me. Continuing through the tunnel felt like walking into a trap. Desperate, I pulled out my phone and called out into the darkness, "Stay back, or I'll defend myself." My voice echoed off the walls, and for a moment, the clicking stopped. I was bluffing, of course. I didn't have anything to defend myself with, but I hoped my words would be enough. Then I had an idea. I quickly found a video of a gunshot sound effect on YouTube, cranked up the volume, and played it. The sound was louder than I expected, reverberating through the tunnel like the real thing. I prayed that whoever, or whatever, was in there bought the bluff. Without waiting to see if it worked, I sprinted through the tunnel, not stopping until I reached the other side. My heart was pounding, and I could hardly catch my breath. I turned back, half expecting to see someone or something chasing after me. Instead, I saw another flash of light deep in the tunnel, illuminating two silhouettes standing on the tracks, watching me. That was enough for me. I turned and started jogging back toward my car, but before I could get far, a horrifying screech echoed from the tunnel. It was a sound I'll never forget. Human, but twisted, filled with anger, and something else I couldn't quite place. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. And as I drove away, I knew one thing for certain: I would never, ever hop on a train again. This happened years ago, and it's the first time I've shared this story with anyone outside of my family. I'm curious to hear what others might think about it. I come from a large family on my mom's side, and I've always been close to my cousins, especially those from my aunt's family. My aunt and uncle have 8 kids, and because they're well off, they live in a spacious house with a good amount of land, about 4 acres in total. Only 1 acre is cleared for the yard, though. The rest is dense woods. Back then, I used to visit them almost every day. We were all homeschooled, so we had plenty of free time to just be kids, playing outside or exploring the woods. One day, about 5 years ago, my oldest cousin and I had been playing outside all day. As it started to get dark, we decided to head inside. Without any lights, it was almost impossible to see anything in the woods. My sister and our 8-year-old cousin were still playing outside when my cousin and I went down to the basement to play video games. A little while later, my cousin and sister burst through the basement door, out of breath and clearly terrified. My cousin was crying, and my sister looked like she'd seen a ghost. They were so shaken that they could hardly speak. When we finally calmed them down enough to ask what was wrong, my cousin, still crying, pointed toward the tree line. The basement door is made of glass, so from inside, you can usually see most of the yard. But because the yard slopes downward, if you're sitting down, you can't really see the bottom of the tree line. We stood up and walked to the door to get a better look outside. That's when we saw him. A man standing just a couple of feet from the woods, dressed in a white suit with a hat on. His face was hidden in shadow, and though it was hard to make out details, it was unmistakably a person standing there. He appeared to be wearing gloves, too. Naturally, we panicked. We bolted upstairs to tell my aunt and uncle, who were in the kitchen. But by the time they made it downstairs to check, the man had vanished. We never saw him again. To this day, my cousin and I both agree it was definitely a man in a white suit. Now, there's another part to this story that happened a couple of years later. My other cousin, who is one of the younger sisters in the family, had an experience that seems connected. She's older than me, but younger than the cousin who saw the man with me. When she was about 15, she moved from her room upstairs to the basement, which had a window that faced the backyard, much like the basement door. She only stayed in that basement room for a week. During her first few nights there, she had recurring dreams that someone was watching her through the window. On the 4th night, I happened to be staying over, hanging out with my older cousin upstairs. It was around 1 or 2 in the morning. Everyone else had gone to bed hours earlier. We were in the kitchen making popcorn when suddenly, she came running upstairs, crying and saying that someone was outside her window, watching her. We were shocked. She was 15 at the time, not a little kid, so it wasn't just childish imagination. But the way she was acting, we wondered if she was still half asleep, even though she was standing in the kitchen, talking with her eyes partly open. It wasn't the first time we'd seen someone in the family have a sleepwalking episode after a bad dream. My aunt heard the commotion and came to take her back to bed, but she didn't sleep in the basement that night, and a few days later, she moved back upstairs for good. I'm not sure if these events are connected, but they seem like they could be. Nothing like this has happened since, and it's been a long time now. What do you all think? Could these events be related? Or is it just a series of strange coincidences? In 2020, just as the COVID-19 pandemic was beginning, I had a job that required me to work overnight shifts at a hospital. My schedule was always unpredictable, and after each shift, I drive home along the same parkway. This parkway wasn't usually busy, even during the day, and at night, it was practically deserted. The pandemic only made it feel more like a ghost town. On most nights, I wouldn't even see state police patrolling, which was both eerie and convenient since I could get home quicker. One night, in the early hours of the morning, I was driving home as usual when I noticed something unusual, a red flashing SOS light up ahead on the side of the road. It was illuminating the taillights of a car that was parked there. Someone clearly needed help, and I suppose I was in a helpful mood that night, so I decided to pull over in front of the car. As I passed the car, I saw a man waving his arms in the air, signaling for assistance. I turned on my hazard lights, got out of my car, and walked over to him. He was a Hispanic man, judging by his appearance and slight accent, though because of the mask he was wearing, I couldn't guess his age with much certainty. If I had to estimate, I'd say he was in his late 20s or early 30s. I asked him what was wrong, and he explained that his car battery had died after he'd been pulled over for too long. I asked if he had jumper cables, but he said no, and unfortunately, I didn't have any either. I wasn't sure how else I could help him, so I offered him a ride. But then he asked if he could borrow my phone since it was also dead. I hesitated. The idea of handing over my phone to a stranger in the middle of the night made me uncomfortable, but I decided to help him. I unlocked my phone and handed it to him, opening the phone app so he could make a call. He walked a little distance away as he spoke into the phone, and I noticed that his car door was open. Curiosity got the better of me, so I decided to sit in the driver's seat and see if I could turn on the car myself. To my surprise, the keys were still in the ignition. I turned the keys slightly, and the battery came to life. I tested the hazards and the radio, and they both worked fine. Finally, I turned the key all the way, and the car started without any issues. That's when things took a dark turn. Before I could even process what was happening, I felt two arms wrap around my throat from behind, trying to choke me. I heard the man with my phone shouting from outside, "Hey, hey," over and over again. I managed to break free from the grip of the person in the back seat, a young teenager who must have been hiding there all along. The man outside was now running back toward the car, still yelling at me. In that moment, I chose to flee. I bolted back to my own car, started it up, and sped away as fast as I could. As I drove off, I heard a loud pop that I later realized was a gunshot. When I looked in my rearview mirror, I saw that my rear windshield had a hole in it, with cracks spidering out from the impact. I couldn't call the police right away, because the man still had my phone. When I finally got home, I told my parents everything and used our house phone to call 911. I explained that I had walked into a trap, that someone had been hiding in the back seat of the car, and that the man still had my unlocked phone with all my personal information on it. The police advised me to contact my phone provider immediately to track the last call made, but unfortunately, customer service didn't open until 7 a.m. In the meantime, I used my dad's phone to lock my device through Find My iPhone, hoping I did it before they could access my home address. When 7 a.m. came, I called my phone provider to check the call logs. To my surprise, no calls had been made after I handed over the phone. This meant the man never actually called anyone. Then came the worst news. My Bitcoin holdings in my Coinbase account, which were worth a significant amount, had been transferred to an untraceable wallet. The phone's location stopped updating soon after, either because it had been turned off or discarded. I never got it back. A week later, I was woken up by my parents. My dad knocked on my door and told me to come downstairs and outside. He said that both he and my mom had heard someone in the backyard, but when we checked, we didn't see anyone. My mom wanted to call the police, but my dad decided to wait until we heard another noise, which never happened. I don't know if what they heard that night was connected to the man who had my phone, but the thought of it terrified me. My home address was saved in multiple places on that phone. Thankfully, nothing more came of it, and it's been 2 years now. But that experience changed me. I will never stop to help someone on the highway at night again. I'm a truck driver based out of Reno, Nevada, and though I've had my fair share of long, uneventful nights on the road, a few strange encounters stand out in my memory. I usually drive line haul routes, and while I'm used to the solitude, there have been a few moments that were unsettling. One time, I was returning from Independence, California, and decided to pull over at a Vista Point on Highway 395 near Mammoth Lake for a quick nap. It was early winter, around 4 a.m., and the temperature had dropped to about 25 degrees. After my nap, I stepped out of the truck to stretch my legs, relieve myself, and enjoy a quick smoke. That's when I noticed something odd, a flashlight in the distance, about 200 feet away. It was darting around erratically, but not pointing in my direction. The thing is, there was nothing out there, no cars, no buildings, no reason for anyone to be wandering around in that area, especially at that hour. I finished my smoke and climbed back into my truck. Out of curiosity, I kept watching the flashlight and decided to turn on my marker lights. As soon as I did, the flashlight immediately swung in my direction, then went dark. It was as if whoever was holding it didn't want to be seen. The suddenness of it sent a chill down my spine, but I figured it was best not to linger, so I moved on. Another odd experience happened on that same road. I had pulled over for another quick nap. It was quiet, just like any other night, until I was suddenly jolted awake by the sound of someone banging their hands along the length of my trailers. The sound echoed through the fog that had settled in, but when I looked around, I couldn't see anyone. The noise was unmistakable, though, and it didn't take long for me to decide that it was time to get out of there. I started up the truck and left without looking back. The last strange occurrence I remember happened while I was driving on Route 139 in California. There's a campground along the way, and I pulled over to take a quick break. It was a new moon that night, and the stars were out in full force. The darkness was so complete that the orange marker lights from my truck cast long shadows into the wilderness around me. As I stood there, taking in the night sky, I suddenly heard rustling in the distance. At first, I thought it was just an animal, but then I saw a figure emerge from the shadows. It was a man standing there, watching me. The stillness of the night made the encounter all the more unsettling. I didn't wait to find out what he wanted. I quickly got back into the truck and drove off, leaving that eerie moment behind. These are the only strange experiences I've had in all my time as a truck driver. They weren't terrifying, just odd and unsettling. They serve as a reminder that the open road can be as mysterious as it is lonely. A few days ago, I had an experience that I haven't been able to shake. I was house sitting for my boyfriend, Jason, while he was away on a backpacking trip. Jason lives in a semi-remote area at the bottom of a hill, right next to a highway. Across from us is a small rural neighborhood. The area is a mix of well-kept homes and abandoned, rundown properties, a typical countryside setting where people tend to keep to themselves. I didn't feel uneasy about staying there. I had Jason's dog, Max, with me, a 115-pound American Bulldog and English Labrador mix. Max is all muscle and has become very protective of me, especially since we started dating. I also had my own dog, Daisy, a 57-pound poodle mix who's a bit more on the friendly and fluffy side. Because Max is so strong, I can't walk both dogs together by myself. So I usually take Daisy out first and then I go back for Max. I like walking Max at night because I feel safer with him as it gets darker. 4 nights ago, I was almost done with my walk with Daisy when I got this unsettling feeling that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and when I glanced back, I saw a tall man in a hoodie standing near an old, rundown house about 30 feet behind me. The hoodie struck me as odd because it was early August in Northern California, and even with the sun setting, it was still around 87 degrees. I tried to brush it off, thinking I was just being paranoid. But as I kept walking, I noticed the man was keeping pace with me, never closing the distance but never falling behind. Every time I turned a corner, he did too. If I sped up, so did he. Finally, I reached the highway and crossed it just before a car sped past, hoping that would create some distance between us. It did, but he kept following me. I walked as fast as I could towards the house, not daring to look back, but now I could hear his footsteps on the gravel. Daisy, sensing something was wrong, started barking and growling. I urged her forward and made it back to the house, slamming and locking the door behind us, thinking that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. Moments after I locked the door, I heard someone trying to open it. Both dogs started barking like crazy, alerting me that something was definitely wrong. There's no peephole on the door, but I could hear a man's voice through the barking. "I love your dog."
"Can I meet her?" he said.
There was something eerie about the way he said it. It sounded rehearsed, like there was no real emotion behind the words. I yelled back, "No, please go away." He paused for a moment and then repeated, "I love your dog. Can I meet her?" This time, he started trying the door handle again, pushing against the door. At this point, Max, sensing the danger, started growling fiercely, his fur standing on end. Daisy was barking too, but Max's growl was deep and terrifying. I don't know what came over me, but I quickly put Daisy in the bathroom and grabbed Max by the collar, holding him close to the door. The man outside kept repeating that he wanted to meet my dog, and then he slammed into the door. I could see the door move from the impact. That's when I unlocked it and opened it just enough for Max to lunge halfway out. Max was going berserk, teeth bared, barking ferociously. The man wasn't expecting that. He stumbled back, nearly falling, and then he turned and bolted up the hill, disappearing from sight. I pulled Max back inside and immediately called the police to report what had happened. Unfortunately, I didn't get a good look at the guy, and the police told me there wasn't much they could do, but they took my statement and said they'd contact me if anything came of it. That night, I couldn't stop hugging Max. I was so grateful for him. The next day, I drove nearly an hour to buy him the biggest bone I could find as a thank you. And, of course, I got Daisy something too. Looking back, I don't know why the man didn't take the hint with both dogs barking inside. Maybe he thought both dogs were like Daisy, harmless and fluffy. I'm just thankful he didn't have a weapon. I probably should have just called the police and kept the door shut, but I hope that seeing Max scared him enough to stay away for good. If he ever tries to come back, though, Max will be ready to protect us again. In the early 1990s, I was attending college in upstate New York. It was my first extended stay away from home, and the experience was both exciting and a bit disorienting. The college town I was in was built around a picturesque lake, and with the arrival of autumn, the once bustling area transformed into a nearly deserted ghost town. The vibrant atmosphere of summer quickly gave way to the dull, lifeless gray of the winter sky, which seemed to persist until spring. One of my housemates, Alex, was a casual dealer of cannabis, which worked out perfectly for me as I was quite the enthusiastic user at the time. We had a tradition of preparing elaborate dinners where every dish included some form of cannabis. These meals often resulted in satisfied appetites, hazy minds, and a kitchen that required a significant cleanup effort. Our dinners became quite popular, and soon, students from other houses wanted to join in. The unspoken rule was that our guests were responsible for cleaning up after the meal. Somehow, everyone seemed to be more than willing to help out, and our place quickly became the social hub of the neighborhood. One particularly frigid, windy night, we had 4 or 5 female guests from another college. I was in a relationship at the time, so I kept things respectful, but the rest of my housemates were more carefree. Despite the wintry weather and the fact that it was a weeknight, everyone had a great time. When it was time for our guests to leave, their car refused to start. Naturally, they came to my door since I was the only one with a functioning vehicle. It was around midnight, and their home was about an hour away. I agreed to drive them, though I was a bit reluctant. Alex decided to join me for the trip. The roads were pitch dark, and the cold was biting. To top it off, it started snowing heavily. Navigating through unfamiliar territory in those conditions made for a nerve-wracking drive. Despite the challenging conditions, we eventually reached their neighborhood. Their home was a converted estate with a long, winding driveway and large iron gates. As we turned onto the driveway, the snowfall intensified. In the distance, we noticed two faint red lights. As we got closer, we realized it wasn't a car but an old-fashioned stagecoach making its way through the snow. We drew closer to overtake it and saw that it was a large, black stagecoach drawn by a team of black horses. The red lights we had seen were lanterns attached to the sides of the stagecoach. The driver was dressed entirely in black, sitting rigidly and staring straight ahead, seemingly oblivious to our presence. Everyone in the car saw the stagecoach. We asked our guests if this was something they were familiar with, but they had never seen anything like it. At the time, we found it odd but didn't think much of it, chalking it up to a peculiar local custom or something out of the ordinary in the countryside. After dropping the guests off, Alex and I turned to head back home. We fully expected to encounter the stagecoach again, as their house was the only structure at the end of the driveway. To our surprise, we saw no sign of it. No horses, no hoof prints, no tracks of any kind, just our own from when we arrived. It then dawned on us, likely a delayed realization after the evening's festivities, that we might have seen not just a stagecoach, but ghostly horses and a phantom carriage. It's been over 30 years since that night, but whenever I run into Alex, we always end up reminiscing about the eerie encounter we shared.